The war did not always begin with the sound of gunfire. Sometimes it began with silence. In the final years of World War II, fear no longer marched with soldiers. It fell from the sky without warning. It arrived as a buzzing sound, then silence, then destruction. As Nazi Germany faced defeat, it unleashed weapons meant not just to fight armies, but to terrorize entire cities. Rockets, pilotless bombs, jet fighters, and machines built to turn fear into a weapon. This is the story of how war itself changed and how terror became technology. The V-2 rocket marked a turning point not only in the history of warfare, but in the history of human technology itself. It was the first weapon to leave the Earth's atmosphere and return at supersonic speed to strike its target. With its arrival, war crossed a boundary that could never be reversed. Distance, warning, and defense lost much of their meaning. The future of missiles, spaceflight, and global deterrence began not in an era of peace, but in the final, desperate years of Nazi Germany during World War II. By the early 1940s, Germany was no longer fighting the fast, decisive war it had planned. The conflict had become a grinding struggle against enemies with superior manpower, industrial capacity, and access to global resources. Allied bombers devastated German cities and factories, while the Eastern Front consumed men and material at an unsustainable rate. Conventional weapons could no longer promise victory. In response, the Nazi leadership increasingly turned to so-called vengeance weapons, hoping that fear and shock could achieve what strategy no longer could. The V-2 rocket emerged from this mindset. Its origins, however, lay before the war. German rocketry research in the interwar period had been driven largely by scientific curiosity and dreams of spaceflight. Engineers such as Wernher von Braun envisioned rockets as tools to reach beyond Earth, not as instruments of terror. These ambitions were quickly redirected once the military recognized the weapon's potential. Research facilities such as Peenemünde became centers not of exploration, but of weaponization. Technologically, the V-2 was astonishing for its time. Standing more than 14 meters tall and weighing more than 12 tons at launch, it was powered by a liquid fuel engine burning ethanol and liquid oxygen. When ignited, the rocket rose vertically before tilting and following a ballistic arc toward its target. At its peak, it reached altitudes exceeding 80 kilometers, technically entering space. It then descended at speeds faster than sound. There was no warning, no air raid sirens, no defense. The explosion came first, the sound followed afterward. This made the V-2 fundamentally different from all previous weapons. Aircraft could be intercepted, artillery shells could be heard. Even the V-1 flying bomb announced itself with sound. The V-2 offered no such mercy. It was unstoppable once launched, rendering existing air defenses obsolete overnight. In purely technical terms, it represented a leap decades ahead of its time. Yet this brilliance concealed profound weaknesses. The V-2 was not accurate by modern standards. Its guidance system, though advanced for the 1940s, could not reliably strike specific military targets. Accuracy was measured in kilometers. As a result, the rocket became primarily a weapon aimed at cities rather than military installations. London, Antwerp, and other urban centers were targeted not for their strategic value, but for their psychological impact. The intention was to terrorize civilian populations into demanding surrender. In this goal, the V-2 failed. Civilians suffered and died, but morale did not collapse. Governments did not negotiate. Industrial production continued. The rocket consumed vast resources while delivering limited military effect. Each launch required rare materials, skilled labor, and complex logistics at a time when Germany lacked fuel, aircraft, tanks, and trained soldiers. The darkest aspect of the V2 program lay in its production. As Allied bombing intensified, manufacturing was moved underground to facilities such as Mittelwerk. There, tens of thousands of concentration camp prisoners were forced to work under brutal conditions. Starvation, disease, beatings, and executions were routine. Prisoners slept beside the machines they operated. The death toll was staggering. Historians estimate that more people died building the V2 than were killed by its deployment. This fact alone defines the moral legacy of the weapon. From a strategic perspective, the V2 represented a catastrophic misallocation of resources. It arrived too late, in too small numbers, and without the ability to influence the battlefield. By the time V2 attacks peaked in late 1944, Allied armies were already advancing on all fronts. The rocket did not delay defeat. It merely added suffering to a war already defined by devastation. Ironically, the V2's greatest impact came after the war ended. As Germany collapsed, Allied powers raced to capture rockets, documents, and scientists. Both the United States and the Soviet Union recognized the weapon's significance. The foundations of Cold War missile programs were built directly upon V2 technology. The same principles that delivered destruction over Europe would later launch satellites, probes, and human beings into space. This dual legacy makes the V2 uniquely troubling. It stands at the intersection of human ingenuity and human cruelty. It proved that extraordinary technological progress could be achieved even under moral collapse, and that the same knowledge could later be repurposed for exploration and communication. The road to the moon ran through the ruins of Peenemünde and Mittelwerk. In the end, the V2 did not win the war for Nazi Germany. It did not even come close. It failed as a strategic weapon and succeeded only as a harbinger of things to come. It transformed warfare, reshaped geopolitics, and permanently altered humanity's relationship with distance and speed. It also stands as a warning. Technology alone does not determine the future. The values and choices behind it do. The V1 flying bomb introduced the world to a new and deeply unsettling form of warfare, automated, pilotless, and designed to terrorize civilian populations through repetition rather than precision. Where the V2 struck without warning, the V1 announced itself with sound. Its distinctive buzzing noise echoed across the skies of southern England, becoming one of the most psychologically powerful weapons of World War II. As long as the sound continued, people knew the weapon was still airborne. When it stopped, they understood that impact was only seconds away. By the time the V1 was deployed in large numbers, Nazi Germany was losing control of the war. Allied forces dominated the air, German cities lay in ruins, and the invasion of Western Europe had become inevitable. The V1 emerged from the same mindset that produced the V2, the belief that fear could compensate for strategic defeat. It was cheaper, simpler, and easier to produce than ballistic rockets, making it more suitable for mass terror attacks. Technologically, the V1 was crude compared to the V2, but this simplicity was deliberate. It was essentially a small unmanned aircraft packed with explosives. Its pulse jet engine was loud, inefficient, and unsophisticated, but it required few materials and could be assembled quickly. Unlike conventional aircraft engines, it relied on rapid bursts of combustion, creating the distinctive sound that earned it the nickname Buzz Bomb. This noise became a psychological weapon in its own right, turning everyday life into a state of constant anticipation and fear. Guidance systems were basic. The V1 could not be steered toward a specific building or military installation.
A simple mechanical system measured distance traveled and cut the engine once a preset range was reached. From that point, gravity took over. Accuracy was poor, but accuracy was not the objective. Cities were the target. Civilian life was the battlefield. Most early V-1s were launched from ramps hidden in northern France, particularly in the Pas-de-Calais region. Launch crews could prepare and fire the weapon quickly, allowing for sustained bombardment. In June 1944, just days after the Allied landings in Normandy, the first V-1s struck London. The timing was intentional. Germany hoped to disrupt the invasion by forcing the Allies to divert resources to homeland defense and by undermining civilian morale. For civilians, the experience was uniquely horrifying. Unlike conventional bombing raids, which came in waves and allowed for warning, the V-1 hovered in the sky like a threat that refused to resolve itself. Streets would fall silent as people listened. Children learned to recognize the sound. When it stopped, panic followed. Some bombs struck homes, others factories, others empty streets. The randomness itself became a form of terror. Unlike the V-2, however, the V-1 could be fought. British air defenses adapted rapidly. Radar stations tracked incoming bombs. Anti-aircraft guns were repositioned along likely flight paths, and fighter squadrons were reassigned specifically to intercept the flying bombs. Pilots developed extraordinary tactics, including shooting the V-1 down or even tipping its wing with their own aircraft to disrupt its flight and send it crashing harmlessly into open land. These defenses gradually reduced the weapon's effectiveness. Interception rates climbed steadily. As Allied ground forces advanced through France and Belgium, launch sites were captured or destroyed, dramatically reducing the number of bombs reaching their targets. Germany attempted to adapt by launching V-1s from aircraft over the North Sea, but these efforts proved inefficient and costly. Despite its limited military effectiveness, the V-1 had a profound psychological impact. It targeted the rhythms of civilian life rather than military infrastructure. Sleep was disrupted. Anxiety became constant. Yet even here, the weapon failed to achieve its ultimate goal. British morale bent, but it did not break. Production continued. Political resolve hardened rather than weakened. From a strategic standpoint, the V-1 was another example of resources diverted towards terror rather than decisive military effect. Each bomb consumed materials and labor that Germany could no longer afford. Like other late war weapons, its production increasingly relied on forced labor, embedding human suffering deep into its history. The true significance of the V-1 lies not in what it achieved during the war, but in what it represented. It marked the beginning of automated, unmanned attack on mass scale. The idea that a weapon could be launched, fly independently, and strike without a pilot fundamentally changed military thinking. Modern cruise missiles and drones trace their conceptual lineage directly back to the V-1. The ethical questions raised by the V-1 remain unresolved. When machines deliver death remotely, responsibility becomes diffuse. Distance dulls accountability. The V-1 was an early glimpse of a future in which war could be waged without direct human presence at the moment of destruction. In the end, the V-1 did not change the outcome of the war. It failed as a tool of coercion and succeeded only as a prototype of future warfare. The buzzing sound that haunted the skies of 1944 was more than a weapon. It was a warning of conflicts yet to come.
Messerschmitt Me-262. The Messerschmitt Me-262 entered the war like a message from the future delivered to a world still fighting with the tools of the past. It moved faster than anything else in the sky, climbed with an ease no propeller-driven aircraft could match, and struck with a violence that stunned those who faced it. For Allied pilots, the first encounters were bewildering. The aircraft did not turn or dive like familiar fighters. It simply appeared, fired, and vanished. In that brief moment, it seemed possible that technology alone might yet alter the course of the war. By the time the Me-262 became operational, Nazi Germany was already losing control of the air. Years of attrition had hollowed out the Luftwaffe. Experienced pilots were dead or exhausted, fuel was scarce, and factories were under constant bombardment. Allied bombers struck deeper and more frequently, escorted by long-range fighters that erased Germany's last defensive advantages. Conventional piston-engined aircraft could no longer stem the tide. Something radically new was required. Jet propulsion offered that promise. Unlike propeller-driven aircraft, jets were not limited by blade efficiency at high speed. In theory, they could fly faster, climb quicker, and intercept bombers before escorts could react. German engineers had been experimenting with jet engines since before the war, but progress was slow. Early engines were unreliable, fuel-hungry, and prone to failure. High-temperature alloys were scarce, and Germany's industrial base struggled to produce components with the necessary precision. Despite these challenges, the Me-262 took shape. Its design was revolutionary, a sleek airframe with twin turbojet engines mounted under the wings, freeing the nose for heavy armament. The result was an aircraft capable of speeds exceeding 850 kilometers per hour, far beyond anything the Allies could field at the time. In straight-line flight, it was untouchable. Firepower matched speed. The Me-262 carried heavy cannons designed specifically to destroy bomber formations. A short burst could tear through aluminum and steel alike. Against massed bombers, the jet was devastating. Crews described attacking with a sense of overwhelming superiority, firing once or twice and watching entire aircraft disintegrate. Yet the Me-262's promise collided with the reality of a collapsing war effort. The engines that powered it were marvels of innovation, but they were fragile. Lacking sufficient heat-resistant materials, they wore out quickly. Many engines lasted only a few dozen hours before requiring replacement. Maintenance was constant, and spare parts were increasingly unavailable. Fuel shortages compounded the problem. Jet engines consumed large quantities of high-quality fuel, precisely what Germany lacked by 1944. Even when aircraft were available, they often sat grounded, unable to fly. Training suffered as well. New pilots were rushed into jets with minimal preparation, transitioning from basic trainers directly into one of the fastest aircraft ever built. Accidents were frequent and deadly. Leadership decisions further undermined the aircraft's potential. Adolf Hitler, fixated on offensive symbolism and retaliation, insisted that the Me-262 be adapted as a bomber rather than deployed immediately as a fighter interceptor. This decision delayed its introduction at a moment when Germany desperately needed to counter Allied bombing. Engineers and pilots protested, recognizing that the jet's true value lay in air defense. Their warnings were ignored. Months were lost to redesigns and testing, while Allied bombers continued to devastate German industry. When the Me-262 finally entered combat in meaningful numbers, the strategic situation had already turned against Germany. Allied air superiority was overwhelming. The jet achieved impressive results in isolated engagements, but it could not be everywhere at once. Too few were produced, too many were grounded, and too many were destroyed on the ground before ever taking off. Allied forces adapted quickly. Recognizing that dogfighting jets at altitude was futile, they targeted them during their most vulnerable moments, takeoff and landing. Jet engines responded slowly to throttle changes, making the Me-262 sluggish at low speed. Allied fighters loitered near airfields, waiting to strike as jets climbed or returned.
Bombing campaigns focused on runways, fuel depots, and factories, disrupting operations without needing to defeat the aircraft directly. In this way, the Me-262 was defeated not by superior enemy aircraft, but by superior systems. Logistics, airfield denial, intelligence, and numerical superiority mattered more than raw speed. The jet could win individual encounters, but it could not win the air war. There was also a human dimension, often overshadowed by technical fascination. Production of the Me-262 relied increasingly on dispersed factories and forced labor as bombing intensified. Prisoners worked under brutal conditions, assembling components, often without adequate food or safety. The aircraft's elegance in the sky concealed suffering on the ground. Pilots, too, bore a heavy burden. Flying the Me-262 was exhilarating and terrifying. Its speed forgave few mistakes. Mechanical failure at high velocity was often fatal. Many pilots understood they were flying a machine from the future in a war already lost. Their victories, however dramatic, could not change the larger outcome. Strategically, the Me-262 revealed a fundamental truth about modern warfare. Technological superiority cannot compensate for strategic collapse. An advanced weapon requires fuel, trained personnel, infrastructure, and time. Germany lacked all four. Innovation arrived, but the conditions necessary to exploit it were gone. After the war, the significance of the Me-262 became fully apparent. Allied engineers studied it intensely. Its configuration, lessons, and failures shaped post-war jet development across the world. The jet age began not in peace, but amid the ruins of a defeated empire. Every modern fighter owes something to the Me-262, not as a triumph of war, but as a proof of concept realized too late. In the end, the Me-262 did not save Germany. It could not, but it permanently changed aviation. It stands as a reminder that the future can arrive early, yet still fail to alter the present when history has already turned against it.
The Sturmgewehr 44 changed warfare, not with spectacle, but with permanence. While rockets thundered and jets screamed overhead, this rifle quietly rewrote how infantry would fight for the next century. It emerged from a simple realization born of brutal experience. Most firefights were decided at short to medium range, where traditional bolt-action rifles were too slow and submachine guns too limited. In the hands of ordinary soldiers, the STG-44 offered something new: control, volume, and flexibility in a single weapon. And in doing so, it altered the balance between the individual soldier and the battlefield. At the start of World War II, infantry doctrine across Europe was still shaped by the First World War. Rifles were accurate and powerful, but slow to cycle. Machine guns provided firepower, but were heavy and required crews. Submachine guns fired rapidly, but lacked range and penetration. German units relied on a combination of these tools, but as the war expanded, particularly on the Eastern Front, this system began to break down. Combat increasingly took place in forests, ruined villages, trenches, and cities, where engagements unfolded quickly and distances were short. Soldiers needed sustained fire without sacrificing reach. German engineers identified the core problem not as the rifle, but as the ammunition. Full-power rifle cartridges generated recoil that made automatic fire uncontrollable and unnecessary for typical combat distances. The solution was an intermediate cartridge, powerful enough to be lethal at several hundred meters, yet light and controllable enough for rapid fire. The 7.92 by 33 mm Kurz round was the result, and it became the heart of a new category of weapon. Development of the rifle that would fire this ammunition faced resistance at the highest levels.
Adolf Hitler initially opposed the concept, convinced that existing rifles were sufficient. To circumvent this, the weapon was disguised bureaucratically as a submachine gun, receiving the designations MP-43 and later MP-44. Field trials on the Eastern Front changed everything. Reports from combat units were unequivocal. Soldiers equipped with the new rifle were more effective, more confident, and better able to dominate close-range engagements. Fire superiority shifted decisively at the squad level. When Hitler finally approved the weapon, he gave it a name loaded with symbolism: Sturmgewehr, or storm rifle. The term suggested aggression and breakthrough, but its true significance lay elsewhere. The rifle combined selective fire, a detachable magazine, and intermediate ammunition into a single practical system. It allowed soldiers to switch between semi-automatic precision and automatic suppression as the situation demanded. This adaptability was revolutionary. Technically, the STG-44 was designed for mass production under wartime constraints. Stamped metal components reduced machining time and cost. A 30-round magazine provided sustained fire without excessive weight. While not flawless, the rifle was heavy, and early models suffered reliability issues. It represented a balanced solution to real battlefield needs rather than a theoretical ideal. In combat, especially on the Eastern Front, the STG-44 changed the dynamics of infantry fighting. German squads armed with the rifle could lay down suppressive fire without relying solely on machine guns. Engagements became faster and more fluid. Soviet troops encountered a weapon that outperformed submachine guns at range while matching them in volume of fire up close. In urban fighting and dense terrain, this advantage was decisive at the tactical level. Yet the STG-44 arrived too late to alter the war's outcome. Production was limited by bombing, shortages, and the collapsing German economy. Only a fraction of infantry units ever received the rifle. Training standards declined as experienced soldiers were lost. Ammunition supply struggled to keep pace. Like many advanced German weapons, the STG-44 was a solution to a tactical problem introduced after strategic defeat had already become inevitable. There was also a hidden cost. As Germany's labor pool collapsed, production increasingly relied on forced labor. Factories assembling components did so under brutal conditions. The rifle that empowered soldiers on the front was built through coercion and suffering, far from the battlefield. This reality complicates its legacy and tempers admiration for its design. Despite these limitations, the STG-44's influence was immediate and enduring. After the war, its concept spread rapidly across the world. Both Eastern and Western designers recognized the logic of the assault rifle: intermediate ammunition, selective fire, and controllability. The most famous descendant, the AK-47, adopted the same fundamental principles, prioritizing simplicity and reliability for mass armies. Western designs followed a parallel path, culminating in modern service rifles used today. What makes the STG-44 unique among late-war German weapons is that it succeeded not as a terror weapon or a symbol, but as a practical tool. It did not promise to end the war with fear or spectacle. It simply made soldiers more effective. That quiet effectiveness is why its legacy endured long after rockets fell silent and jets were grounded. In the end, the Sturmgewehr 44 did not save Nazi Germany. It could not compensate for strategic failure, industrial inferiority, or moral collapse. But it permanently changed how wars would be fought. Every modern infantry battlefield still carries its imprint, a reminder that sometimes the most transformative weapons are not the loudest, but the most practical.
The Panther tank. The Panther tank emerged from shock. When German forces first met the Soviet T-34 in 1941,
The encounter shattered assumptions that had guided armored warfare since the opening Blitzkrieg campaigns. Shots that should have penetrated armor glanced away. Mud and snow swallowed narrow tracks. Enemy tanks maneuvered where German vehicles bogged down. In that moment, the armored balance shifted, and Nazi Germany was forced to confront a hard truth. Its tanks were no longer the benchmark of the battlefield. The response was the Panther. It was conceived not as a propaganda weapon or an experiment, but as an urgent corrective born of battlefield necessity during World War II. German engineers studied captured T-34s obsessively, identifying what worked and why. Sloped armor, wide tracks, and a gun optimized for long-range tank killing became the foundation of a new design philosophy. The Panther would combine protection, firepower, and mobility in a single platform meant to restore parity and ideally superiority on the Eastern Front. From a technical standpoint, the Panther was a revelation. Its sharply angled armor dramatically increased effective thickness without a proportional increase in weight, a lesson learned directly from Soviet practice. Its 75mm KWK 42 L70 gun delivered exceptional muzzle velocity and penetration, allowing Panther crews to destroy enemy tanks at ranges where return fire was ineffective. In open terrain, the Panther could dominate engagements before the enemy even realized they were under threat. Mobility was equally emphasized. Wide tracks distributed weight more effectively, improving performance in mud and snow. A powerful Maybach engine promised speed and agility uncommon for a vehicle of its size. On paper, the Panther was the ideal answer to the realities of modern armored warfare, a balanced, lethal machine designed for the conditions Germany now faced. But war does not wait for perfection. Pressed by the deteriorating situation on the Eastern Front, the Panther was rushed into service before its design had matured. Extensive testing was sacrificed to urgency. Mechanical reliability suffered as a result. Early Panthers were plagued by engine fires, transmission failures, and breakdowns that immobilized vehicles before they ever reached combat. In some units, more Panthers were lost to mechanical failure than to enemy action. This weakness became painfully clear during the Battle of Kursk in 1943. Intended as the decisive test of German armored power, Kursk instead exposed the limits of late war innovation. Panthers that functioned properly proved deadly, destroying Soviet armor at long range and absorbing punishment that would have destroyed earlier tanks. Yet many never made it to the battlefield, breaking down along the way or being abandoned by crews unable to repair them under fire. Kursk marked a turning point. The Panther had demonstrated its potential, but it had not delivered the breakthrough German planners needed. Soviet defenses were deep, well prepared, and supported by overwhelming numbers. The failure of the offensive confirmed that even superior tank design could not compensate for strategic overreach and material inferiority. As production continued, many of the Panther's early flaws were addressed. Reliability improved, though never to the level engineers hoped for. Crews learned how to exploit the tank's strengths while managing its limitations. On the Western Front in 1944, Panthers proved formidable defensive weapons. Allied tank crews learned to fear frontal encounters, relying instead on flanking maneuvers, artillery, air power, or numerical superiority to defeat them. Yet the context had changed irrevocably. Fuel shortages limited training and operations. Spare parts were scarce. Allied air superiority turned roads into killing zones, making movement hazardous and resupply uncertain. Even the best tank was vulnerable when isolated, immobilized, or attacked from above. There was also a human dimension to the Panther's story that rarely appears in technical assessments. Crewing and maintaining the Panther required skill and experience, both increasingly scarce as the war dragged on. New crews were rushed into service with minimal training, expected to master a complex machine under combat conditions. Production, dispersed to avoid bombing, relied heavily on forced labor. The Panther's steel hull concealed suffering far from the front lines, tying its legacy to the broader moral collapse of the regime that built it. Strategically, the Panther illustrates a recurring late-war pattern. Germany produced weapons of exceptional tactical quality, but lacked the industrial capacity, logistics, and air cover to deploy them effectively at scale. Allied forces pursued a different philosophy. Simpler, more reliable tanks produced in overwhelming numbers, supported by secure supply lines and total air dominance. Individual inferiority mattered less than systemic strength. The Panther's post-war legacy, however, was profound. Engineers across the world studied its design closely. Sloped armor, powerful medium-caliber guns, and a balance between mobility and protection became defining features of the post-war main battle tank. In this sense, the Panther helped shape the future as it failed to save the present. In the end, the Panther did not lose because it was poorly conceived. It lost because it was introduced into a war already slipping beyond Germany's control. It was a brilliant answer to yesterday's problem, fielded too late and under conditions that denied it the support it needed to succeed. The Panther remains one of the most respected tanks of the war, a symbol of how excellence at the tactical level cannot overcome collapse at the strategic one.
In the end, these weapons did not save Nazi Germany. They did not reverse defeat, stop advancing armies, or change the outcome of World War II. What they did was change the future. They showed how fear could be engineered, how distance could be erased, and how technology could strike faster than warning, mercy, or defense. The rockets fell silent, the jets were grounded, the machines were abandoned, but their ideas survived. Modern warfare was born in those final, desperate years. And the lesson remains: when technology runs ahead of humanity, the cost is always paid by those who never chose the war at all.